Having grown up in the Irish Catholic community in Liverpool in the 1970s and 80s, I have from an early age been immersed in Marian devotional practices. And I'm glad, therefore, to have this opportunity to speak on this occasion, when we mark the feast of the Annunciation here in Oriel College, known from the time of its foundation as the House of the Blessed Mary, the Virgin, in Oxford. I have some serious words coming up, but it was suggested to me perhaps I should begin with what I'd like to note, an aside, not in my text, just as a measure of the extent to which the habits of Marian devotion were entrenched in the community in which I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It used to be said that if you went up to a playground, if you pulled out in a playground, Catholic school, at those times, hello Mary, or as we would have said, hey Mary, then half the children would have turned around. And if you were then to about please, the other half the girls would have turned around. Okay, now some more serious ones. I'm no biblical scholar, and rather than engage with the details of our text, literary or linguistic or historical context, I thought I'd simply say a little about how this passage Mary presents, as it seems to me, a prototype for the Christian life, by modelling a distinctive kind of choosing and a distinctive kind of agency. If you turn to any textbook in moral philosophy, you will find, of course, various accounts of what it is to choose well. One of the more influential of these accounts maintains that choosing well is fundamentally a matter of choosing in such a way as to give due acknowledgement to the past. To take a simple example, if someone has been my friend, then in deciding how I am to relate to that person in the present, I am to consider what it would take in practical terms to give due recognition or to honour this truth about our shared history. And this will be so, we might suppose, even if the friendship has now lapsed. On another, second, widely influential account, in choosing how to act, my attention should rather be directed not to the past but to the future, since actions are to be assessed fundamentally by reference to their tendency to bring about good outcomes and thereby to shape the future. In our text from the reading today, Mary offers, I take it, another perspective on what it is to choose well. A perspective of a kind that's not standardly represented in the moral philosophy textbooks. When Gabriel reveals to Mary the sweep of the divine purposes for creation, holding out the prospect of a kingdom that will have no end, Mary responds by saying, as the Latin translation has it, fiat, or let it be so. And this is to say, I take it, that Mary trusts Gabriel when he says that, as our text says, with God nothing shall be impossible. Or as another translation has it, that no word from God will ever fail. So Mary takes this story concerning the ultimate future of this changing world to be one she can count on, as vouchsafed in a divine promise. And thereby she takes this future, the one envisaged in the story, in rather the way that ordinarily we take the past. When we take the past as past, to provide a fixed reference point for our choosing. So in this respect, Mary's fiat effects an ideal of choosing that's like the past reference ideal that I sketched just now, to the extent that here the thought that guides our choosing most fundamentally is not what must I do if my actions are to have a certain causal impact on the future course of the world, but rather, what must I do if my actions are to give due acknowledgement to an already established narrative, one that shapes the sense that my actions can bear in the present. But at the same time, of course, this idea of choosing is forward rather than backward looking, since it looks forward to a kingdom that will have no end, or as we might say, looking looks forward to the future consummation of all things in the divine love. And in this respect, the model of choice that Mary sets before us in this passage resembles the future reference ideal of right choosing. So in brief here, Mary undoes a standard polarity around the nature of well-formed choice, as represented in philosophical discussion, by offering us an ideal of choice that's forward-looking, yet not ordered fundamentally to the bringing about of good consequences, but rather to the acknowledgement of who we already are by virtue of the truth about who we are to be as given in the promises of God. Though I shan't dwell on the point here, Mary's idea of choosing is also distinctive with respect to its content and not only to its structure. She goes on, of course, to tell us what she takes the pattern of the divine activity as revealed in the Jewish scriptures to have been. And at least implicitly hereby she tells us what that pattern will enduringly be. On this vision, what we've heard recited in the Magnificat, God is the one who has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts, who has put down the mighty from their seats, who has filled the hungry with good things, and exalted the meek. Here it's social polarities that are reversed. And if we take this narrative, this envisaging of the future, as a reference point for our choosing in the present, then we should ask ourselves, how am I to act if I am to give due acknowledgement to, or to honour, the truth guaranteed in the divine promise that the person before me now is, however low in their social station, or whatever their afflictions, the object of an unswerving divine love, and called to share in the life of God in a future that will have no end. That's not quite the question I mentioned just now, the question of how I am to relate in the present to a person who in the past shared a certain fellowship with me by virtue of having been my friend. But from that question, from our sense of what we should say in response to that question, I think we already have some intonation of how, in terms of its content, as well as its structure, Mary's ideal of choosing radically reconfigures our conventional sense of what it is to choose well. As well as setting before us a distinctive ideal of choosing, Mary's response to Gabriel's address also reveals a distinctive idea of agency. Again, this ideal is not standardly represented in the moral philosophy textbooks, which very often celebrate a kind of agency that is autonomous or self-sufficient or rationally self-directing. By contrast, in her reply to Gabriel's address, Mary says not only fiat, let it be so, but also fiat mihi, let it be unto me according to your word. My colleagues who understand these things tell me that the Greek text that's translated in the Vulgate as fiat can in effect bear the sense of an imperative or command. So here Mary's agency is being foregrounded. She's not simply overwhelmed by Gabriel's address, but takes an active stance on the vision for the future that he sets before her. But at the same time, this stance, while active, is also one of making way, of receiving, of catching or latching onto the divine telos or divine directedness that runs through all things, while giving to that telos a form that bears the imprint of Mary's individual concerns and her individual character. So here is an ideal of agency as involving not fundamentally self-assertion, nor equally mere self-abnegation, but what we might call a kind of imperatival receptivity. Here's, if you like, a further kind of polarity, the one between agency and passivity that's undone in Mary's choosing. In the words of Bernadette Clairvaux, with grateful thanks here to John Barton for alerting me to this passage, we can therefore call upon Mary in her encounter with Gabriel to speak the word and receive the word. It's lowercase and capital case, W of course. Speak the word and receive the word. To offer what is yours, Bernard says, and conceive what is God's. Here the language of speaking and thereby receiving, offering what is ours and thereby conceiving what is God's, picks out the activity in receptivity or activity in responsiveness that constitutes, we might suppose, the Marian ideal of agency. So Mary offers a paradigm of Christian discipleship with respect to the kind of choosing and also the kind of agency that comprises the Christian life. In brief, this is a choosing that's fundamentally narratival or storied rather than causal or consequentialist in structure, while at the same time being directed to the future. And this is the kind of agency that preserves and upholds the person in their individuality, while at the same time locating their agency within a pattern that runs through all things, one that's ordered ultimately to filling the hungry with good things and raising up the meek. Aside from Christ's crucifixion and Mary herself holding the infant Jesus, in the history of Western art there is perhaps no more widely depicted scene than that of Gabriel addressing Mary. And this artistic tradition stands, of course, as a testament to the deep and imagination-shaping power of that story. And different pictorial renderings of the Annunciation in effect present different conceptions of how Mary's agency stands in relation to the divine or an angelically mediated agency. Perhaps the single best known rendering of the scene, and for me anyway, theologically one of the most profound, is Botticelli's Castello Annunciation, which you can find reproduced on the cover of your service sheet. So I conclude with these thoughts on this picture. Here we see displayed once again the overturning of our established conceptions of hierarchy, as Gabriel, one who is, as Luke's text tells us, stands in the presence of God, stoops before this young, vulnerable woman. We also see how Mary's body traces an arc that registers the impact of Gabriel's address. But at the same time, Mary does not simply reel from the force of that address, since her movements are instead very clearly minded and purposeful and infused with her own agency. Moreover, the scene as represented by Botticelli is of course strikingly beautiful. The beauty that's revealed specifically in the inflections of Mary's body is in part discernible from a purely secular vantage point. That is, from the perspective of the person who has no knowledge of the narrative that's being represented here. But when we locate this scene, painted scene, within that particular story context provided by the biblical story, then of course we see an additional beauty in Mary's demeanour, and we see the very particular gracefulness that is exhibited in this dancing movement, considered as a response to this disclosure, the one given in Gabriel's address. Here Botticelli alludes then to the distinctive kind of beauty that a human life can bear when that life takes the form of an acknowledgement of a divinely promised future. In these ways, Botticelli's picture directs our gaze to the themes we've been considering. It invites us to take Mary's example as a prototype of the Christian life, and on that basis to think anew about what it would be to choose well and to act well, and then to ask what it would be to give due recognition to the divinely promised story within which our lives are set, one in which it is the meek rather than the mighty who are in the end the drivers of history, and what it would be to genuinely to act, yet in such a way as to latch on to the divine pattern in things. In these ways, Mary's example speaks to us across the centuries, offering a transformation in our self-understanding and in our choices and actions, one that is no less radical in our time than it